The first knock sounded like a loose branch tapping the siding, quick and hollow. The second knock was steadier, a human rhythm that didn't belong to the wind. Emma lifted her head from the kitchen table where a stack of envelopes sat like a row of small storms. The lamp had gone dark an hour earlier. Only a stub of candle threw a wavering circle of light over a chipped mug and the top bill stamped in red, past due. Rain worked at the windows. The old duplex felt smaller without electricity. No hum from the fridge, no soft buzz from the heater, only water and wind. She reached for the wooden dowel she kept by the door and stood for a moment, listening. Another knock. She set the dowel against her leg and breathed in the smell of damp plaster. Through the peephole she saw a blur of a man. Head, shoulders hunched as if he could make himself smaller against the rain. He had no umbrella, only a dark shape in his arms, bundled and still. The porch light was out, so the only glow came from her candle and the street's dull reflection off shiny pavement. When he stepped back, the shape shifted and coughed, a thin rasp swallowed by thunder. Emma cracked the door on the chain. Cold air pushed in, needling her face. "What do you want?" Her voice came out even enough to make her proud. "A dry corner for the night," the man said, keeping his hands visible, open. "Just until the water goes down, my boy's soaked through." The boy coughed again. The sound was worse up close, a wet catch that made Emma's ribs tighten. She glanced past the man to the street. The gutter had become a shallow creek, leaves and grit spinning fast toward a storm drain that gurgled and complained. "You shouldn't be knocking on doors after dark." She said it because it was true, and because it bought her a breath. In the upper duplex, Mrs. Duffy's blinds twitched. Emma imagined the older woman's radio turned low, weather warnings between prayers. Tomorrow, there would be whispers over fences, and Emma would be the fool who let a stranger in. The man shifted his weight but didn't step closer. "I understand." His voice was gentle but tired, the kind of tired that had edges. "We tried the shelter. It's full. The bus stopped running. I thought." "One night." "What's your name?" Emma asked. "Daniel." He angled the bundle so she could see the boy's face, pale, lashes wet, lips parted. "This is Eli." "How old?" "6." The chain pulled at the door frame as the wind surged. Emma's fingers stung from the cold. She thought of the envelopes on the table, of the candle burning down to its last inch, of the kettle she could still heat on the gas flame. She thought of last year and the person who smiled and ran up a tab in her name and how long it took to clean up the mess. Her hand went reflexively to the dowel. She wasn't that Emma anymore. She also wasn't made of stone. "Back up a step," she said. When he did, she slid the chain free. Rain blew in with a slap, scattering droplets over the entry rug. "Shoes off. You stay in the living room. You touch nothing but the couch and the towel I give you." "Yes, ma'am." He said it without sarcasm, only relief. They stepped inside, careful of the puddle collecting at the threshold. Emma shut the door firmly and bolted it. The duplex exhaled. She set the dowel back in its corner, where it looked more like a broom handle than a threat. "Sit there," she told him, pointing to the couch. "I'll get a towel." The boy shivered as Daniel lowered him to the cushions. Emma hurried down the small hall, past the bedroom where a patch of damp ceiling had spread like a map, and found the woven wool blanket her grandfather used to keep in the back of his truck. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm and smelled faintly of cedar. In the kitchen, she turned the gas knob and held a match to the burner. Blue flame. She set water to heat and pulled a tin of black tea from the cabinet. The candle guttered but held. When she returned, Daniel had peeled off Eli's wet jacket and was rubbing his small arms with careful hands, murmuring something soft that was more tone than words. "Here," Emma said, offering the towel and blanket. "Wrap him. I've got tea coming." "Thank you." Daniel's eyes met hers for a heartbeat, steady, unassuming. He worked quickly, draping the blanket around Eli's shoulders, tucking it under his chin. The boy's cough eased to a whisper. Emma could feel her own shoulders lower a fraction. She set a metal bowl on the floor beside the couch for the dripping clothes and opened the window a finger width to let steam escape. The room took on a living smell again, wet wool, old wood, the clean bite of rain. "What happened to you two?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Car died near the freeway," Daniel said. "We walked. I thought the rain would lighten up." He winced at his own miscalculation. It didn't. "Wrong night." She poured hot water over tea bags and chipped mugs and brought them to the low table. "This neighborhood floods if you look at it wrong." "I see that." He blew on the tea. "I didn't want to scare you." "You did," she said simply. She sat in the chair across from the couch, the candle between them like a small truce. "But the kid's worse off than my nerves." Eli blinked as the heat worked in. He lifted the mug with both hands when she nudged it closer, inhaling the steam. "Thank you," he whispered, voice hoarse. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Emma said before she could stop herself. The word surprised her. Daniel's mouth softened. Thunder rolled again, farther off now but still muttering. The duplex creaked the way old houses do when they settle into weather. On the table behind her, the bills waited, patient and undeniable. Emma looked at them, and then at the two soaked strangers in her living room, and something like a scale shifted inside her. Kindness didn't erase numbers, but it made a different kind of sum. "We'll be quiet," Daniel said, misunderstanding her glance. "We'll be gone as soon as it's safe." "Be gone when I say it's safe," she answered, sharper than she intended. Then, gentler, "Drink your tea. Boots by the mat." He did as told. For a while, there were no words, only the crack of rain in the downspout, the clink of ceramic when Eli set his mug down. Emma listened for trouble and heard none. The house held. Her fear didn't leave. It changed shape, finding edges she could carry. When she rose to fetch another candle, Daniel stood too. "Please don't trouble yourself," he said. "It's no trouble." She lit the wick and placed the new flame near the window. A warmer light spread across the room, and in it, the boy's face looked less gray. "We don't have much," she added, almost to herself, "but we can keep the water off your heads. Sometimes that's Nia didn't agree out loud. She looked at the door she had just closed, at the chain resting like a thin necklace against the wood. The choice sat there, plain as the towel on the arm of the couch. One night, she told herself, not quite a prayer and not quite a promise, just the measure she could live with. One night, and the door she had opened would stay that way until morning. Emma didn't put the wooden stick down right away. Even with the door bolted behind them, her knuckles stayed tight around the smooth length of wood, her shoulders square as she watched the two figures she had just let inside. The duplex felt smaller with strangers in it, shadows climbing the pale walls where candlelight flickered. She kept her stance between them and the hall as if her body could barricade the rest of the house. Daniel set his boy gently on the couch. He crouched low, stripping off wet boots and socks, then pulled the blanket closer around Eli's thin frame. Steam rose faintly from the boy's damp hair. The air smelled of rain-soaked wool and wet leather. Eli coughed sharply, the kind of cough that rattled. Emma winced but didn't move closer. A year ago she had trusted someone who smiled with soft eyes and quick hands, and the price of that mistake still lived in her drawer full of debt notices. That lesson had carved itself into her. She wasn't about to forget it. Not tonight. Her grip on the stick loosened a little but stayed firm. Daniel kept his head bent toward his son, whispering something that Emma couldn't catch. It was the sort of low murmur that wasn't meant for outsiders. A father's rhythm meant to anchor a child in the middle of a storm. He rubbed Eli's arms briskly through the blanket, then cupped the boy's forehead with his palm. "Still warm," he muttered under his breath. Emma exhaled and crossed to the kitchen. The gas flame sputtered but held, blue against the old pot she set over it. She dropped in a crumpled packet of instant soup, stirring with the back of a spoon until the water clouded yellow. The smell was plain but filling, a scent she remembered from nights when her own cupboards had been nearly bare. She rummaged through the hall closet for another towel. The top shelf held a stack of linens, most thin with age, but one stood out. a faded cotton towel her grandmother had given her when she first moved in. It was frayed at the edges, the floral pattern washed almost white, but it was clean. She carried it back to the living room. Tong looked up as she approached. His eyes caught the candlelight, tired but steady. He started to rise, but she shook her head sharply. "Stay with him." She dropped the towel into his waiting hand. He mouthed a thank you, almost too soft to hear, and began drying Eli's face and hair with slow, careful strokes. Old armchair across from them, the stick leaning against her knee. She watched each movement, how Daniel shook out the towel before draping it over the back of the couch, how he adjusted the blanket so it covered the boy's feet. He didn't glance around the room, didn't reach for anything that wasn't offered. His focus was entirely on Eli. The boy coughed again, a racking sound that made his small body tremble. Daniel rubbed circles on his back until the fit passed. Then he lifted the mug Emma placed on the table and coaxed Eli to sip. The steam curled into the dim room, carrying the salty scent of chicken powder and noodles. Eli swallowed with effort, then sagged against the couch, eyelids heavy. Emma folded her arms, leaning back into the chair. The wood of the stick pressed into her palm, grounding her. She studied Daniel in silence. He wasn't handsome in the glossy way of the men who had once come through the diner. His hair stuck damp to his forehead, and his shirt clung, wrinkled and wet. But his hands were sure and gentle, and his voice stayed even. Daniel caught her watching. "I'll make sure he doesn't cough too hard," he said quietly. "I don't let strangers in," Emma replied. Her voice was flat, but trembled faintly at the edges. "Blankets, I know," he answered. He kept smoothing the blanket around his son's shoulders. "You didn't have to, but you did." Emma glanced at the candle stub on the table, the wax pooling around its base. She thought of the stack of bills in the kitchen, of the hours she worked for tips that barely stretched, and yet here she was, giving away the last soup packet, the last clean towel. It was foolish, maybe worse. Still, the sight of the boy's chest rising and falling with steadier breaths held her in place. She pushed herself up, went to the cupboard, and returned with a chipped teapot. She set it on the burner until the faint scent of black tea filled the air. She poured into 2 mismatched mugs, sliding one across the table toward Daniel. "It's hot," she said, almost brusque. He accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," he said again, meeting her eyes. There was no performance in it, no attempt at charm, just plain gratitude. The duplex fell into a quieter rhythm. Outside, the rain softened from a hammering to a steady hiss. The candle flame danced against the window pane, reflecting 3 figures in the small room, one sitting stiff in a chair, one hunched over a sleeping boy, and the boy himself, cocooned in borrowed warmth. Emma leaned the stick back into its corner. She wasn't ready to put it away completely, not yet, but her hand no longer reached for it every few minutes. She drew her own knees up into the chair, sipping the weak tea, letting its warmth spread. Daniel looked across the table once more. "One night is more than enough. Tomorrow, when the rain eases, we'll be gone." Emma set her cup down, her gaze still on the boy. She murmured under her breath, almost to herself, "By morning the storm will pass. You'll have to leave." The words hung in the air, half a promise and half a warning. Still, she didn't rise to bolt the bedroom door or blow out the candle. The light stayed, small and persistent, casting both wariness and an uneasy kind of peace across the duplex walls. Emma stood in front of the kitchen cabinet, the candlelight behind her throwing long shadows over the chipped paint of the doors. The storm still raged outside. The wind whistled through the smallest cracks around the windows, making the duplex shiver. She pulled open the cabinet, and the shelves offered little comfort. Half a bag of rice, a tin of beans she had promised herself to save for next week, and one last can of condensed chicken noodle soup. Her stomach tightened. That can had been her fallback for the week ahead, the one small assurance that she wouldn't go to bed empty. Now it was the only thing standing between a coughing child and another night of fever. She ran her fingers over the can, its label peeling at the edges. A memory surfaced unbidden. her mother once setting a similar can on the table during another winter when money had been thin. Back then it had felt like treasure, enough to make a cold evening feel less harsh. Emma exhaled, picked it up and carried it to the counter. The choice was made before she could talk herself out of it. Daniel's voice drifted from the living room. "He's warmer now. The blanket helps." It was quiet, carrying both relief and exhaustion. Emma struck a match, lit the burner, and set a small pot on the flame. The metal pot was dented, its handle loose, but it still held water. She poured the contents of the can into it, the thick soup sliding out with a faint slurp, golden broth speckled with noodles. As the pot began to bubble, the scent of chicken rose, mixing with the damp smell of the storm. Emma stirred carefully, her mind restless. Daniel's words echoed, "Stay until it's safe." She had let them in. She had promised herself it was only one night, but as the steam curled toward the ceiling, she wondered if kindness had already nudged her further than she intended. When the soup was ready, she ladled it into 2 mugs, the only clean ones left, and carried them to the living room. Daniel sat with Eli cradled against him, the boy's eyelids heavy, his cheeks flushed. Emma set one mug on the table and pressed the other gently into Daniel's hands. "For him," she said. Daniel hesitated. "You should—" "Children first," she cut him off. Her tone left no room for argument. She crouched beside the couch, holding the mug as Eli took a few slow sips. The boy's lips curved faintly, as though the warmth was enough to make him dream. Daniel watched in silence. His hands rested on his knees, knuckles pale. He seemed torn between gratitude and shame. Finally, he said, his voice low, "You didn't have to use what you had left." Her chest ached with the truth of it. "Soup tastes better when someone else needs it more." She looked at Eli, at the way the boy's head rested against his father's chest. "He'll sleep easier." The boy managed another spoonful, then drifted into shallow breathing again. Emma pulled the blanket higher around him, smoothing the fabric. Daniel's gaze never left her. In the quiet, Emma moved back to her chair, wrapping her arms around herself. The candlelight flickered, casting uneven light over the worn furniture, the threadbare rug, the stack of unopened envelopes on the counter. The duplex looked exactly as it always did, sparse, tired, but lived in. Only tonight it held more than her solitude. It held a stranger's gratitude, a child's fragile breath, and a can of soup stretched further than she ever meant it to. Daniel finally lifted the second mug and sipped. His eyes closed briefly as though he needed the warmth to steady him. Then he looked around the small room. His gaze caught on the cluttered counter where the envelopes lay, one corner visible in red ink. Final notice. He didn't speak, but the weight of what he saw settled heavily between them. Emma followed his eyes. She pressed her hands together, whispering to herself, "Just one night." But even as she said it, the image of the empty cabinet haunted her. One night's kindness had cost her more than she could easily spare, yet she didn't regret it. Daniel set the mug down carefully, his expression unreadable. He glanced again at the envelopes, then at Emma. In that moment, the girl who had opened her last can of soup seemed to him braver than anyone he had known in a long while. And as the storm pressed against the walls of the duplex, Emma held herself straighter, unaware that her quiet act of sacrifice had already begun to change the course of more than just one night. Eli stirred before the first hint of morning, his small body shifting under the blanket that still held a trace of cedar. The storm had slowed, but the wind continued to hum through the duplex walls like a tired chorus. Emma, who had dozed upright in the armchair, opened her eyes at the sound of his cough. She leaned forward instinctively, checking the boy's flushed face. Daniel's hand was already there, smoothing back damp hair with a touch that spoke of long practice. Emma started to rise, but Eli pushed weakly at the blanket, reaching for the pocket of his soaked jacket that hung from the chair. His fingers curled around something inside, and when he pulled it free, a small bundle of colored pencils clattered onto the low table. Tucked with them was a folded page from a worn sketch pad. "Sweetheart," Daniel whispered, trying to ease the supplies back into the pocket. "Rest. You don't need—" His head. His voice was scratchy, no louder than a breath. "I want to draw." Ragazzo hesitated, then pushed the candle closer so its glow stretched over the table. "Let him," she said softly. "Sometimes doing helps more than sleeping." Her own words surprised her. She had no practice with children, yet the certainty in her voice made Daniel pause, then nod slowly. Eli gripped the pencil clumsily, his hand still trembling. He bent over the page, tongue caught between his teeth, and began to drag color across paper. Emma sat quietly, watching the little strokes form lines and blocks. The crackle of the tiny fireplace filled the silence, broken now and then by the boy's shallow cough. Minutes passed. Emma realized she was holding her breath, as if disturbing him would break the fragile thread of concentration. Daniel's eyes stayed on his son, pride tempered with worry. Finally, Eli held the paper up, his arms unsteady but triumphant. "See?" he rasped. "It's her!" The drawing showed a squat shape of the duplex, hunched against crooked streaks of rain. At its center, a door swung open, golden light spilling outward. In the doorway stood a figure with yellow hair and wide eyes, Emma. Outside, two smaller shapes waited, a tall man and a boy with a scarf. Crayons had turned the storm into a swirl of dark blues and grays, but the door blazed bright, a beacon. Emma's throat tightened. "That's me?" Eli nodded solemnly. "You opened the door. That's when it felt like home again." His small hand pressed the page flat, smudging one corner. "Second home." Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze shifting from the drawing to Emma. Something in his expression softened, a weight giving way. "He hasn't drawn since—" He stopped, looking away for a moment. "Since his mother passed." The unfinished thought hung heavy in the room. Emma's fingers brushed the table as if to ground herself. She had spent months building walls around her life, convinced that letting anyone inside meant losing something. Now, a child she'd known less than a day had painted her as light in a storm. Eli fumbled for the tape Emma kept near her sewing kit. With her help, he pressed the drawing against the peeling wallpaper above the couch. The paper wrinkled at the edges, but it held. For a moment, the dull living room seemed brighter, as if the candle flame had leapt into the crayon sunburst on the page. Emma stepped back, arms folded tight over her chest. She didn't want Daniel to see how her eyes burned. She had nothing extraordinary to give, no wealth, no security, not even more soup in the cupboard. Yet here was a child, declaring that her simple act had made another roof feel like home. Daniel looked at her then, not just with gratitude, but with something deeper, an acknowledgement she wasn't ready to name. It unnerved her. She turned away, fussing with the blanket at Eli's feet, but she felt his gaze linger like warmth at her shoulder. The room fell quiet again, the drawing trembling slightly in the draft. Emma sank back into the armchair, staring at the crayon lines glowing faintly in the candlelight. The storm had not yet lifted, and the man and boy were still strangers in her home. She pressed her lips together, whispering inwardly, was it right to open that door? Or had she just invited a story she couldn't contain? The question echoed in her chest, unanswered, as the drawing above the couch glowed like a fragile promise. Emma woke to a silence she didn't trust. The storm had rumbled all night, shaking the duplex walls, but now the house was still. Pale light slipped through the blinds, watery and new, catching in the threads of the old curtain. For a moment she lay there, not yet sure what had pulled her from sleep. Then she remembered, voices low in the living room, the soft cough of a boy, the rhythm of rain against glass. She rose quickly, heart tapping with unease. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and candle wax. Her bare feet pressed into the cold floorboards as she stepped down the hall. The stick she had left by her chair last night was still there, leaning against the wall, but the living room itself had changed. The couch was empty. The blanket that had cocooned Eli was neatly folded, its edges aligned as if measured. A single towel hung clean and dry over the chair. The mugs she had left on the table were gone from sight, washed and left to dry on the rack in the kitchen. No voices, no movement. Cabinets caught. "Daniel?" The word sounded too loud in the tidy room. She tried again, quieter. "Eli?" Nothing. The hush pressed back. She moved farther in, her pulse quickening. The rug had been shaken straight. Even the firewood had been stacked neatly by the hearth, ready for another burn. The care of it unsettled her more than any mess would have. People in a hurry didn't clean. People leaving for good did. Her eyes landed on the table by the window. There, weighed down by something dark and flat, was a folded piece of cream paper. She crossed the room slowly, as though the floor might betray her with a creak. Her fingers hovered above the envelope before she touched it. The paper was thick, smooth against her skin, not the cheap lined pad she was used to. She unfolded it with careful hands. "Thank you for the warmth, for the kindness, for reminding me that people like you still exist in the world. I won't forget this night." No name, no explanation, just the words, simple and final, printed in neat strokes. Beneath them, in a softer hand, another line. "You helped more than you know." Her throat closed. She read it twice, then 3 times, as if another reading might supply the details the letter withheld. Helped with what? Who exactly had she sheltered? The questions only deepened the emptiness around her. At last her eyes dropped to the object that held the note in place. She had thought it a wallet, or maybe a small case, but when she lifted it, her stomach clenched. It was a card, sleek and weighty, black as lacquer, no name embossed, only a chip and a string of numbers across the back. Not plastic like hers, thin and bending. This was heavier, solid, in a way that whispered of exclusivity. Emma's hand trembled as she turned it over in the pale light. She had heard of such cards, stories whispered in the diner where she worked. Only the wealthiest carried them. Limitless accounts, hidden identities, power condensed into a sliver of metal and code. She had never held one. Never imagined she would. Handis raced back to the man in her living room. Wet hair, tired voice, rough hands drying his son's face with her towel. He had seemed worn, desperate, grateful, but nothing about him matched the card now glowing dark in her palm. Hema sank into the armchair, the same one where she had kept watch through the storm. The folded blanket on the couch stared back at her, proof of their presence and their care. She set the note on her lap and clutched the card until its edges dug into her skin. The duplex, so full last night with coughs and murmurs and small gestures of trust, now felt cavernous. She stared at the door, the same door she had opened with trembling hands. She had let in a man and a boy. By dawn they had vanished, leaving only questions and a token that pulsed with a mystery far beyond her narrow world. Emma closed her eyes briefly, the silence roaring louder than the storm had. She whispered to herself, not knowing whether it was a plea or a vow. What did I let inside? The card gleamed faintly in the dim light, a symbol she couldn't get name, part gift, part warning, entirely beyond her reach, and her hand, still unsteady, would not put it down. Emma stood outside the brick-faced bank on the corner of Hawthorne Street, the morning air sharp with the smell of wet pavement. Spring had crept in quietly after weeks of storms, yet the sky above Portland still carried a low gray weight. She clutched her worn purse against her chest. Inside it, the black card that had kept her awake for nights. Every time she touched it, she remembered Daniel's eyes in the firelight. Tired, steady, grateful. That memory had warmed her then, but now it tangled with suspicion. Why had he left her something like this? Why not a simple thank you, a number, an explanation? The glass door, the brass handle cool beneath her fingers. The bank smelled of polish and faint coffee. People in neat jackets stood in short lines, shuffling checks and receipts. Emma felt underdressed in her faded jeans and thin sweater, her hair tied back in a hasty knot. She almost turned back, but the weight in her purse anchored her forward. Playwright, a teller with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses, looked up. The name tag read, Mrs. Patterson. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that had seen decades of routine. "Good morning. How may I help you?" Emma hesitated, then slipped the black card onto the counter between them. Its surface caught the fluorescent lights, matte and mysterious. She spoke softly, aware of ears around her. "I found this. I need to know who it belongs to." Mrs. Patterson's brow furrowed. She adjusted her glasses and lifted the card carefully, as though it might bite. She turned it over once, twice, then slid it into the machine by her side. The screen blinked. Her eyebrows rose a fraction. She typed again, slower this time. Glazed. "This isn't an ordinary card," she murmured, almost to herself. Emma's heart thudded. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, lowering her voice. "It's part of a private tier, very high level. We don't disclose names attached to these accounts, but I can tell you this much." She glanced at Emma, then at the line forming behind her. "Whoever carries this is among the wealthiest in the country." Emma's stomach dropped. The tiled floor felt unsteady under her shoes. She pictured Daniel again, soaked and weary, coaxing soup into his son's hands. Nothing about him fit the idea of wealth, of limitless access, of hidden accounts. She shook her head. "There must be a mistake. He didn't look like that." Mrs. Patterson returned the card, setting it gently on the counter. "No mistake. These cards aren't given lightly." Emma closed her fingers around it, but didn't slip it back into her purse. "I don't want the money," she said quickly. Her voice wavered, but her words were firm. "I'm not here to spend it. I just wanted to know." Something softened in the teller's expression. She had seen plenty of people's eyes light up when confronted with wealth. Emma's gaze held only confusion and resolve. "You don't have to use it," Mrs. Patterson said, "but you should understand, whoever handed you this didn't do it by accident." Emma shook her head again. "Then I'll find a way to return it. I don't keep what isn't mine." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment longer. Then, with the faintest smile, she said,
"All I can add is this. Anyone who gives a card like this must trust you very deeply."
The words landed heavy. Trust. Emma slipped the card back into her purse with unsteady hands. She thanked the teller, stepped away from the counter, and walked toward the glass doors. Her reflection stared back at her. Plain clothes, tired eyes. A woman far removed from the circles of power the teller described. Outside, the city moved as usual. Buses hissing to stops, bicycles splashing through puddles, people rushing toward offices. Emma stood on the steps with the purse clutched against her side, the black card now burning like a secret she hadn't asked for. "Nee," she whispered under her breath, barely audible above the street noise. "Why me?" The question offered no answer, only the echo of Daniel's voice in memory. "Stay until it's safe." The phrase that had felt like reassurance now sounded like a promise with threads she couldn't yet see. Emma descended the steps slowly, the card's weight pulling at her every step. It was not money she carried. It was a mystery, and perhaps the beginning of a story far larger than her small duplex could contain. The envelope had been waiting for her when she returned from the diner, slipped beneath the door of her duplex like some quiet messenger. Emma had nearly stepped on it, the thick cream paper out of place against the worn floorboards. Her name was written in neat script across the front. Inside, a letter on fine stationery bore words she never expected to see. You are invited to a private interview for the community outreach program at RN Holdings. At the bottom, in confident strokes, the signature, Daniel Hayes, Chief Executive Officer. She had read it 3 times before she believed her eyes. Daniel, the man she'd let in from the storm, the one who had sat on her couch with a sick child in his arms, the same man who had vanished before dawn, leaving only a note and a black card. Now his name appeared beneath a title that felt impossibly far from her world. Emma clutched the envelope all the way into the city. Portland stretched around her, alive with traffic and noise, the air tinged with roasted coffee and damp concrete. She had saved her best blouse for this day, ironing it carefully, though the fabric was already thinning at the cuffs. Her shoes, scuffed at the toes, clicked nervously on the marble floor of the high-rise lobby. Swamp rose like a monument of glass and steel, reflecting a sky streaked with silver clouds. Inside, light pooled over polished stone and brass. People moved with practiced ease, suits pressed, shoes shining, voices low but confident. Emma felt small, as if she had stepped into a world that ran on rules she had never been taught. At the reception desk, a woman with a headset smiled brightly. "Welcome to RN Holdings. Name, please?" "Emma Cole," she said, her voice catching slightly. She held out the letter, as if proof she belonged. "Yes, Miss Cole, we've been expecting you." The receptionist tapped a key and nodded toward the elevators. "Please take the car to the 32nd floor. Mr. Carter will meet you there." Her palms damp against the envelope. She stepped into the elevator, its mirrors catching her reflection from every angle. The doors slid shut with a soft sigh, and the car began its ascent. Numbers ticked upward, 10, 18, 24. Each floor carried her farther from her duplex, from the peeling cabinets and the sound of rain through cracked windows. Nia remembered Daniel's voice in the storm, the way he had said, "Stay until it's safe." She remembered his son's crayon drawing taped to her wall. How did those images belong to the same name etched under the bold letters, Chief Executive Officer? The elevator chimed. The doors opened to a hush of carpet and glass. The 32nd floor was not loud, but reverent, the air scented faintly with leather and paper. A woman in a navy dress gestured politely, leading Emma down a hall lined with photographs of community centers, schools, and families smiling at ribbon cuttings. The contrast was dizzying, images of generosity framed in gilded wood while she still carried overdue notices in her purse. They stopped before a set of tall glass doors. "Please wait here. Mr. Carter will be with you shortly." The woman gave a small bow of her head and departed, her heels clicking away. Emma smoothed her blouse with trembling hands. Through the glass, she could see the faint outline of a figure standing near the window, tall against the backdrop of the city skyline. She could not see his face, only the sweep of broad shoulders, the familiar tilt of his head. The doors opened soundlessly. She stepped inside, her shoes sinking into the thick carpet. Her heart thudded once, hard enough that she felt it in her throat. The man turned, and in that turn, the distance between storm and skyscraper collapsed. Al. Daniel. Clean-shaven now, dressed in a charcoal authority. His eyes, when they found hers, were the same dark, steady ones she had seen by candlelight. For a moment, time seemed to stall between them, the echo of rain against her windows colliding with the gleam of morning light against glass towers. Emma's lips parted, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Who are you, really?" Injecting hung between them, fragile and unsteady, while the city hummed far below. Daniel's smile was calm, almost disarming, as he stepped forward from the window. "I was hoping you would come," he said, his voice steady, the same tone she had once heard across a candlelit room in her duplex. Emma stayed near the doorway, her hand still clutching the envelope. Her eyes flicked around the office, the high glass walls, the polished oak desk, the sweeping view of Portland far below. It felt unreal, too polished, too distant from the rain-soaked man who had knocked on her door. On the desk lay a framed sheet of paper, its edges slightly wrinkled. Her breath caught. Eli's drawing, the crooked little house, the golden doorway, the figure she knew was her. She stepped closer in spite of herself. "You kept it," she whispered. Daniel nodded. It reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. That night, it wasn't just shelter. It was hope. He drew a breath, his hands folding loosely.
Emma, my name is Daniel Hayes. I run this company.
But I didn't want you to meet me as a CEO. I wanted to know if kindness still exists when there's nothing to gain. Emma's jaw tightened. So you lied. You let me believe you were desperate when all along you had this. She gestured at the office, the skyline, the polished wealth pressing in from every corner. I was desperate, Daniel said softly. Not for food or money, for something real. I'd lost my wife, I was raising Eli alone, and all the power I had couldn't fix the emptiness. I needed to see if there were doors in this world that still opened for reasons that weren't about business or profit. Motivations pressed between them. Emma's anger warred with the memory of his tired eyes by the fire. Of his son's frail cough, she crossed her arms, feeling both betrayed and strangely moved. You should have told me the truth. Secured, Daniel admitted, and I'm sorry. But your choice that night, it gave Eli back a piece of safety he thought was gone. And it gave me the courage to believe in people again. Emma lowered her gaze, struggling with the ache in her chest. He had deceived her, yes, but the sincerity in his words was undeniable. Daniel stepped closer, his voice gentler now. I want to build something from that night, something bigger than us. I call it the Open Door Initiative, a program to offer shelter and dignity to families who have none. And I want you beside me, Emma. Her breath caught as his eyes held hers, unwavering. Let's open a new door together, he said. The city stretched silent beyond the glass, as if holding its own breath while Emma searched for words she didn't yet have. Emma stood by the broad glass window of the 32nd floor. The city stretched below her in wet silver lines. Her reflection looked pale against the skyline, hair drawn back, hands twisted in front of her. She heard her own voice again, from the meeting just minutes earlier. I need time. It had sounded steady, but inside her chest, another door had cracked open. Daniel had not pressed her. He had simply nodded, then laid out diagrams across the polished table, sketches of shelters, centers, classrooms. This isn't charity handed down from above, he explained. It only works if people like you shape it. His finger tapped the corner of the page. The heart has to be community. That's where you come in. Emma had listened, torn between awe and wariness. Back at the duplex, the cupboard still echoed with emptiness, yet here she was, being asked to give shape to something larger than her own survival. A week later, the rain still clung to Portland streets. Emma returned home from the diner to find an envelope from the bank waiting on her stoop. Inside was a single line that stole her breath. Your outstanding balance has been cleared in full. She sat on the couch, letter trembling in her hands, fury and relief crashing together. Someone, Daniel, had reached into her life without asking. When she confronted him in the office again, her voice shook. I didn't ask for this. You don't get to erase my mistakes just because you can afford it. Daniel met her eyes without flinching. Then don't see it as erasure. See it as room to breathe. But only accept it if you set the terms. Make conditions I can't break. She stared at him, the weight of her pride heavier than any debt. Finally, with a breath that came from somewhere deep, she said, 3 conditions. First, no favors that paint me as something I'm not. Second, everything is transparent. I won't be a story you polish up for donors. Third, I can say no whenever I believe it's right. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Only the hum of the city outside. Then Daniel's expression eased into something like respect. He inclined his head slowly. Agreed. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders felt lighter, though uncertainty remained. Daniel gathered the papers, sliding them back into the leather folder. "Tomorrow," he said, voice quieter now. "Meet me at your diner." Emma blinked. "The diner?" He nodded. "If we're going to build something together, I need to see where you come alive." The promise unsettled her, yet it sparked something she hadn't felt in years, the sense that her dignity could remain intact even as new doors opened. She glanced once more at the skyline, whispering inwardly that perhaps being repaid didn't have to mean losing herself. The diner smelled of fresh paint and apple pie. A paper sign, handwritten in Emma's careful script, hung across the glass door, closed for renovation. Neighbors passing by slowed to peek in at the bustle, tables stacked in the corner, volunteers rolling paint onto the walls, and in the kitchen, Emma pulling a pie from the oven so the workers had something warm to share. The old photograph of the diner, faded and curled at the edges, lay on the counter as a quiet reminder of what it had been before this rebirth. Later that afternoon, Emma found herself in a small meeting room at R&N Holdings, the scent of paint still clinging faintly to her sweater. Around the table sat Daniel, sharp in his suit but softened by the tired kindness in his eyes. Mr. Carter, his pen tapping as he noted each point, and two representatives from a nearby church along with a handful of older residents who had come to offer perspective. Emma unfolded her notes. Her voice was steady, though her palms pressed tight to keep them from trembling. If this program is about opening doors, it has to reach the people who need it most. Single parents trying to start again, workers who've been laid off and want to study while they take care of families. We should prioritize tuition assistance for them. One of the church representatives nodded firmly. They're the backbone of this community. If they fall, the whole neighborhood feels it. Daniel leaned forward, eyes intent. "So a scholarship fund. We'll set it up under the initiative." He glanced at Emma. "But you'll help decide the criteria." Emma exhaled, a small victory warming her chest. The meeting moved on. Plans for the diner emerged, not as a business alone, but as a Friday night gathering place. "Every Friday," Emma proposed, "we host an open kitchen, a hot meal, no questions asked. Neighbors, drifters, anyone who needs a seat at a table." She glanced at Daniel, daring him to question the practicality. Instead, he smiled faintly. "I'll make sure supplies are covered," he said, "but it stays in your hands." Finally, an older woman with white hair and the scarf suggested forming a circle of retired workers to guide people back into jobs. Men who knew carpentry, women who had run offices, neighbors who still wanted purpose. Emma clapped her hands together softly. A mentoring table. Advice from those who've walked the road already. By the time the plans were gathered, the room buzzed with something almost electric. Daniel reached for the folder before him, pulled out a prepared contract, and signed with deliberate care. "Every cent will be transparent," he said, his pen scratching across the page. "That's the promise." Emma caught the weight of his glance. He hadn't forgotten her conditions. On the wall, someone had pinned a poster drawn by neighborhood children. Bright crayon doors opening into a sunrise, with bold letters, "Volunteers Wanted." The crooked lines and misspelled words made Emma's throat tighten more than any polished brochure ever could. Aggressively, as the group began to disperse, Mr. Carter's phone buzzed. He frowned, scanning the message, his jaw set. "We may have a problem. There's a piece being drafted for tomorrow's paper. It questions whether all this," he gestured to the folders, to Emma, to Daniel, "is favoritism disguised as charity." The warmth of the room shifted, a chill threading in. Emma's heart gave a nervous beat. The painted walls of the diner, the apple pie cooling on the counter, the promises just spoken, all of it suddenly felt fragile, waiting for the weight of doubt to fall. The duplex smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat. Emma had polished the small table until it gleamed faintly under the new light fixture, a soft amber glow replacing the harsh bulb that once flickered. Dinner was simple. Meatloaf baked crisp at the edges, sweet corn glistening with butter, and an apple pie cooling on the counter. Outside, a misty drizzle tapped at the windows, the sort of Portland rain that never seemed to end. Eli perched on his chair, proudly holding up another drawing before the plates were touched. This one showed a house glowing in yellow crayon, every window lit. "See, it's our house now," he said. The little boy's grin stretched wide, and Daniel ruffled his hair with the tenderness that softened the lines of his face. Emma smiled, setting down the old teapot she hadn't used in months. It had first appeared that night of the storm, chipped handle and all. Tonight, steam curled from its spout as she poured tea for three. The sight made her chest tighten, memories colliding with the present. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Duffy, their neighbor with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, shuffled in with her raincoat draped over her arm. She sniffed appreciatively at the food, but wasted no time on pleasantries. "So, Emma," she said, leaning one elbow on the chair, "what's all this about you and the man from the big tower downtown? Folks are already whispering. Don't let yourself become the city's next rumor." Emma met her gaze calmly, though her cheeks warmed. "Let them whisper," she replied, sliding a plate of pie toward her. "I'd rather they taste the food than the gossip." Mrs. Duffy chuckled, satisfied enough, and left soon after, her umbrella tapping the walkway. The room fell quiet. Eli's eyelids drooped as the radio in the corner hummed an old tune, violins threading through static. He curled into the armchair, wrapped in a knitted blanket, and was soon asleep. Emma cleared her throat, glancing at Daniel. "Why did you leave without a word that morning? No goodbye, just a card." Realism leaned back, fingers steepled. His voice was low, stripped of defense. "Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd look at me and see only what I could buy. I didn't want gratitude mixed with suspicion. I wanted the one night you gave us, nothing more." Her hands tightened around her teacup. "And I was afraid of the opposite," she admitted. "That I'd take something from you and owe more than I could ever repay. I don't want my life to be someone else's ledger." Refrigerant hung between them, fragile yet solid. For the first time, they saw not just differences in background, but the symmetry of their fears, each terrified of being misread, of love and kindness turning into transaction. Daniel leaned forward, voice rougher now. "I don't want to be seen as a wallet, Emma, not by you." "And I don't want to live in anyone's shadow," she answered softly. Radio crackled, the rain hissed against the glass, and Eli shifted in his sleep. It might have been enough, that moment of honesty, but then Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and frowned before passing it to her. A message from Mr. Carter lit the display. "Gala invitations have gone out. Media whispers have started." As pulse quickened, the quiet world of her duplex had just collided again with the glare of a city she wasn't ready for. The meatloaf cooled on their plates as silence pressed in, heavier than any storm. Knee chandeliers glimmered above the hall, their light catching on rows of crystal trophies lined along the stage. The hum of whispered conversations threaded through the velvet seats, rising and falling like a restless tide. Emma sat near the front, her palms damp, Mrs. Duffy's warning echoing in her mind, the city's next rumor. When her name was called, she rose and walked to the podium. The microphone amplified the sound of her breath. She kept her story simple: a storm, a knock at her door, one last can of soup shared with a child and his weary father. No embellishment, no grandeur, just the truth of a night when compassion outweighed fear. Resisted shot up from the press row. Clara Jenkins, sharp-eyed, leaned into her recorder. "Miss Cole, isn't it convenient that this act of kindness led you here? Some call it favoritism. Others whisper about a personal arrangement with Mr. Hayes. How do you answer?" The room stilled. Emma's throat tightened, but she didn't retreat. "I set my conditions from the start. No hidden favors, everything transparent. That's the only reason I'm standing here." Her voice didn't rise, but the steadiness carried further than volume. The crowd stirred, murmurs breaking into louder ripples. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Daniel stood near the wings, hands clasped, ready to step in. Yet he stopped himself. For a long breath, he let her remain alone at the podium, steady under the weight of suspicion. Then the announcer's voice cut through the buzz. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Daniel Hayes for a special address." Emma's heartbeat slowed, as if bracing itself for the storm to shift once again. The microphone clicked on, and the hall sank into a hush so sharp it seemed the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Daniel stepped forward, the screen behind him glowing with a map dotted by the first planned open-door centers. His gaze swept the audience, then settled briefly on Emma, standing just off to the side. "In a storm not long ago," he began, his voice steady, "my son and I were given shelter in a small duplex. We were strangers, yet we were welcomed with warmth and fed from the very last can of soup in that home. That act of kindness changed everything." We paused as the hall shifted, murmurs softening. "Tonight I repay in the only way that honors that gift, by paying it forward. Tuition debts will be cleared for Emma Cole and for the first group of working students who need a second chance. The diner where she first opened her door will be restored, not as a monument, but as a community table, open to all." A compy with applause, but Daniel raised a hand. "Every cent will be public, every decision transparent. And Emma will hold her independence. She answers to no one's pocketbook, least of all mine." Then, in a gesture that silenced the last whispers, he reached for Emma's hand, lifting it gently but firmly. "She is the one who opened the first door," he said, the words ringing against glass and stone. Then them screen behind playing bold letters. "Grand reopening, tomorrow." Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by a swell of clapping and camera flashes. The tone in the room had changed, skepticism giving way to curiosity, perhaps even hope. Emma's pulse quickened, but for once it wasn't from fear. The world had just opened wider than she had ever imagined. The duplex no longer sagged with wear. Its walls had been freshened with paint, and a crooked wooden sign reading "Welcome" swung gently on the front door. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of nutmeg and waffles from Emma's oven. Neighbors wandered in through the narrow lane, their laughter soft against the quiet hum of an old record player spinning a country tune in the corner. Nia in the small kitchen, bowls of creamy potato soup and baskets of warm cornbread waited on the counter. Emma ladled portions with steady hands, inviting each guest to sit at the long, mismatched table now stretching across the living room. Volunteers poured sweet tea, and conversations rose, stories of children, gardens, and winters past. Daniel moved quietly, balancing a ladder against the porch to replace the porch light that had burned out weeks ago. The glow flickered on just as Eli ran in, clutching a new drawing. A door opening onto a long table crowded with figures, all smiling. He taped it proudly to the kitchen wall. "This is for everyone," he announced, cheeks flushed. Emma cleared her throat, smiling. "Next Friday, and every Friday after, this will be our warm supper night. Anyone who needs a place can come." Applause rippled gently from the older neighbors. Mrs. Duffy, her eyes damp, stepped forward. "Emma, I was wrong before. About the rumors, about doubting you." "I'm sorry." Her voice wavered, but Emma only opened her arms and gave her a small, forgiving hug. "We all learn," Emma whispered. The record player crackled, filling the pause with the voice of a long-gone singer. Plates clinked, spoons scraped bowls, and laughter spread. Yet as the evening softened, Daniel lingered on the porch. He stood at the top step, the new bulb casting a circle of gold around him, his gaze fixed on the threshold as if weighing a question he had carried for far too long. The night had fallen soft, the porch glowing amber beneath the new bulb Daniel had fixed earlier. A faint drizzle traced down the gutters, each drop tapping like a quiet metronome. Emma stepped out, wrapping her cardigan tighter, and found Daniel waiting on the top step, his hands clasped, eyes searching the dark yard as though weighing words he had carried too long. "I used to believe," he began, voice low, "that I didn't deserve a family anymore. That part of my life had closed, and I was meant to stand outside of it forever." His shoulders shifted, vulnerable in the stillness. Then he turned, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside lay a simple silver band, the metal catching the porch light. The breath caught as she saw the engraving within, 6 tiny words etched with quiet precision. "Thank you for opening the door." He held it out, not with a grand gesture, but with steady sincerity. "I won't promise perfection, Emma. Only this, I'll keep the door open for you, for Eli, for whatever we build together. Always." Her eyes glistened, the drizzle soft against her cheeks. No speech rose in her throat, only a nod, trembling but sure. She slipped into his arms, and they held each other as if the world could wait outside. Explored him was hushed. Then, faintly, the bedroom door creaked. Eli's small voice drifted out, half asleep. "Our house, it has enough lights now." Albeck's chest tightened, Daniel's hand pressed against hers, and in that simple moment the promise felt complete. Not in diamonds or ceremony, but in the quiet act of keeping a door open, together. The morning sun slipped gently through the diner's new windows, warming the polished counters and freshly painted walls. Outside, the pavement still gleamed from last night's rain. Inside, a small line had already formed. Neighbors, older couples, a few weary workers, waiting patiently as steam rose from pots of soup. The chalkboard near the door carried 3 simple words, written in Emma's hand. "Open Door Friday." The air smelled of bread and herbs. A soft jazz tune crackled from a speaker in the corner, filling the room with an easy rhythm. Emma moved between tables with quiet grace, setting bowls down, her apron dusted with flour. Daniel stood by the counter, sleeves rolled up, carrying trays like any other volunteer. Eli darted around with a grin, varying napkins, his laughter cutting bright through the hum of voices. Near the back, Clara Jenkins scribbled in her notebook. She caught Emma's arm gently. "What do you want people to hear from this?" she asked. Emma thought for a moment, gaze settling on the open door where the line continued to grow. "Don't wait until the storm passes," she said softly. "Open the door when someone knocks. That's when it matters." Clara's pen stilled, her expression less sharp, almost moved. As the noon light deepened, Eli stationed himself by the front, holding the door open wide as the last guest shuffled in. His small hands gripped the handle firmly, his eyes bright with pride. The diner buzzed with laughter, spoons tapping, chairs scraping across the floor, no fireworks, just the glow of lamps reflecting on grateful faces. At the back wall hung a framed drawing, recreated from Eli's memory. A cabin in the snow, a golden light spilling from its door. By evening, the chalkboard outside read in bold strokes. "The door is always open on Friday nights. Beyond the threshold, the street glistened wet, but the golden light spilled out across the Portland sidewalk, steady and unbroken." Sometimes the greatest changes in life don't come from grand gestures, but from a single, ordinary act of kindness, like opening a door on a stormy night. Emma's story reminds us that generosity given freely, without expectation, can ripple outward and transform not just one life, but entire communities. It makes us ask ourselves, when someone knocks, literally or figuratively, will we be ready to open the door? As the saying goes, the smallest key can unlock the biggest door. And maybe the smallest choice we make today can unlock a brighter future for someone else tomorrow. If this story made you pause and reflect, drop a 1 in the comments. Which state are you watching from? I'd love to know. Niece, and if you enjoy stories that warm the heart and spark conversation, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one.